Hello and welcome to this 4IT techELITE webinar in association with InfinityWorks, applying iterative architecture in the enterprise. My name is John Edwards and I'm delighted to introduce our two speakers this evening. Anna Broadhurst is a practice lead at InfinityWorks with a background in delivery, including program management and business analysis, and having spent 12 years as a software engineer, Anna has been involved in quite a number of digital transformation programs. Ben Brunton is a principal consultant at InfinityWorks with 10 years of software engineering under his belt. Ben has worked on many large-scale programs in sectors as diverse as financial services, betting and gaming, advertising, and healthcare. Anna and Ben set out that conventional wisdom holds that the enterprise should plan for the future to future-proof the business. But the problem is that unless you can predict the future, future-proofing will be either a reckless gamble or simply impossible. They will take us through a different approach. Through applying principles of iterative architecture, the enterprise can learn to operate in the moment and so be confident and comfortable in a world of continuous change. Well, we'll see. You will no doubt have questions as Ben and Anna go through their presentation. Please use the chat function in your GoToWebinar dashboard at the right-hand side of your screen to ask them as they occur to you. And then during the Q&A at the end of the webinar, Ben and Anna will deal with as many as we have time to deal with before we close at 7 o'clock. So I will hand over the screen and the presentation controls to Anna. Welcome, Anna and Ben.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. As if I can remember how to do it. There we are.
Okay, so you should be able to see my screen now. Yep. Okay, cheers. Cheers, John.
Okay, so it's common sense to plan for the future, isn't it? We need to make sure that what we build today doesn't need rebuilding. So we should anticipate all possible future scenarios, right?
Are you sure about that, Ben? I mean, that's like saying that you know what the future has in store. What if the future changes? What if you change your mind? After all, businesses do that all the time, right?
Yeah, you're right. The future is always a work in progress. And by the end of this talk, you lot out there will want to see it that way too.
So there are some sensible sounding reasons as to why this way of thinking about the future seems important. For example, you hear these kind of objections all the time. So the business won't want to pay for it later. We need to get the technical masterpiece planned and budgeted for.
But if you can't justify the expense later, why are you asking them to pay for it now? To me, it makes more financial sense to pay for it later when it's needed. And when you know that it's right, you're going to have to pay for something later, aren't you? So keep the immediate cost lower and pay for the right thing at the right time.
Yeah, but I think then they'll start saying, no, we mean, pay for it later. As in, if you don't plan it now, you'll get it wrong. You'll miss things. You'll cut corners. And we don't want to do that, do we? So having a well-defined, collectively approved technical blueprint for the future will guarantee quality.
It just doesn't there, does it? Like that might seem to provide assurance that things are being done properly, but it doesn't guarantee quality, does it? Under the pressure of delivery, the first thing to go out the window is the plan. And actually, an upfront design is more likely to have its corners cut than having a continuously planned series of blueprints. Something they might say that sounds sensible is this: we don't want to duplicate effort and have to rework things in the future. Like business is terrified of throwing work away.
What do you mean by throwing work away?
Well, if you have to throw it away, it wasn't right the first time, was it?
Yeah, but if the first time was a private beta release to about 20 people, then could have been perfectly right. It meant you went live. You went live quickly and you learned.
But then you have to rewrite.
Rewrite? Yeah, but you're live and the next iteration will be even better and it'll be based on real data.
Yeah, so I guess by looking at improvements as throwing work away, you're actually risking throwing even more work away, aren't you? Because you're gambling on the future.
Yeah. But what about duplication of effort though, Ben?
Well, it sounds wasteful, doesn't it, having to duplicate effort? And reuse sounds really good, but there's a flip side to it. It can create dependencies by increasing coupling. It makes your first iteration bigger, plus you're second guessing the future again. We need to think really, really carefully before we start pursuing reuse, because it doesn't come for free.
Yeah, because when the time's right to reuse, you can do that work then and you get it right that time.
That's right. So what we're saying is you can't predict the future. A plan doesn't give you what you think it gives you. And we need to operate in a transitional world and get comfortable and confident in existing in the moment and living in a world of continuous change. What we're really talking about is lean architecture, reducing risk and reducing the gamble.
Yes, Ben. So let's explore these three objections in a bit more detail. So starting with planning for the future. This, if you've never seen this before, it is the Sinclair C5. And this was Sir Clive Sinclair's vision of the future in 1985. He made a lot of money out of his Sinclair computer business, and he ploughed it all into this. And, you know, we were all meant to be driving around in these right now, but it only lasted 6 months in production. It turned out nobody wanted one, and we're definitely not driving around in them now, are we? But I suppose they got the electric bit right, but it turns out that people are happier with something like this, a nice fast electric car. And in fact, you know, people still like the bicycle. Put a battery on it and you've got an electric bike. And actually these will go faster than your Sinclair C5 because they only went 15 miles an hour. And here's another example of predicting the future in software. So we can't go live without a comprehensive registration process that links up with all the other added extras that we want our customers to sign up for. And we also need an easy to use account reset for when they all forget the passwords.
But while you're doing that, this came along, didn't it? And everyone wants this now. It's much easier as a developer. You've got OAuth and standards, and you're not storing any credentials or having to do any of those user login flows. And it's miles easier for the user as well.
Yeah, but while you were doing that, this came along and we all realized that you don't even need to log in, you know? Not all journeys need to start by signing in.
And you may not even need to register. And if you try and get your user to do that and they don't need to, well, that can be harmful to your conversions, can't it? So here you can see second top reason for abandoning checkout, wanting to create an account.
Yeah. So these examples are something that the business didn't necessarily need to pay for at all, never mind later. And when you don't have to build what you don't need, you can release quicker, you can focus on quality, and you can move on to building the next thing. And then you're therefore achieving value faster.
Yeah, being bold about going live with the most efficient option, it saves time and money, but it might even be make or break for your product, business, or organization. So have a look at this example. In 2010, IBM Australia rolled out their replacement payroll system for Queensland Health. That's the public sector healthcare provider for the state of Queensland. This project had started life as a 6.19 million Australian dollars contract. But by the time it went live, 2 years later than they'd planned, the bill had grown to 101 million Australian dollars. But it's not just the cost of the delays. When the system went live, thousands of workers were underpaid or didn't receive the payment at all, while thousands of others were overpaid by a total of 400 million Australian dollars. It's really easy at this scale to mess up. Queensland Health, they're a major organisation. They've got 85,000 employees across 300 sites, and their legacy system was really complex and relied on handovers between local processing centres and this central hub, with diverse manual processes to cover a variety of payroll quirks. But building on top of that complexity, at the inception of the project, there was this decision made to use the payroll replacement project as a starting point for a standardised payroll solution across all state government departments. And this ambitious goal informed the technical choices of the solution. They chose WorkBrain and SAP. But a year after IBM had started on the project, this idea of a payroll system that covered the entire Queensland public service was scrapped. But its legacy remained in the technology choices, in the project plans, in the delays that had already started to mount. And at the point of going live, WorkBrain and SAP had both been heavily customized with between 1,000 and 1,500 bespoke customizations, respectively. It was a massive, massive disaster with long-lasting consequences. And in the end, it's cost the Queensland taxpayer an estimated $1.2 billion, Australian dollars.
That's a massive disaster, isn't it? I mean, what do you really think about that, Ben? What went wrong, apart from everything?
Well, you can read up about it, and yeah, in all the case studies and research about it, everything did go wrong. But if you go right back and think about the consequences and the kind of compounding effect of picking that technology choice based on a future requirement that in the end was canned, for me, that's the place to look at. If would this have been front page news if they just built brutally for what they were needing to build in the first instance, and then had to have done some additional work to scale up? I don't think it would have been.
Yeah. I mean, they made some massive assumptions, didn't they? And all the customizations, you know, altogether there was over 2,500 bespoke customizations. You'd have thought that they'd have figured it out a bit sooner, that, you know, perhaps the technology choices that they'd made, obviously in the pursuit of saving money, were actually costing more. So the second objection was you're cutting corners, and that's not what we propose. What we propose is the more efficient path from A to B.
Yeah, when people think about cutting corners, that what they usually mean is deviating from a plan to get live quickly. It happens all the time, doesn't it? We'll just bosh this out and we'll fix it later. Having an ambitious plan which shows what the future looks like, I think can encourage this behavior, because as you're making those compromises, the plan's still there, painting a rosy picture of this future where somebody or other is going to come along and the technical debt is going to be paid off and the work's going to be done properly. But if we don't expect this optimistic future, then we're the ones on the hook for delivering the quality work right now. And we do this by reducing the scope to just what's needed while keeping the quality high, keeping the quality in.
Yeah. So what's that a picture of, Ben?
That's a picture of people cutting corners.
Yeah, well, actually, it's Ohio State University in 1903, and that is called the Oval. And 10 years earlier, a big master plan was proposed that created a layout for an open space with lots of buildings around it, and it wouldn't be crossed by any path. However, as you can see, the students foiled that plan because they started creating their own walking paths to their destinations. And this is it today. It's called the Oval Walkways. But the Oval, despite it, you know, it was never meant to be crossed. But in 1911, the university architect redrew the plan and he formalised this based on where the students had taken the most efficient paths. And for me, this is a great example of how an initial grand plan was changed based on evidence, real data that led to an evolution in design. And this notion of people path is actually now a real method of user-centered design that I think architecture can really learn from. And by anticipating change, you know, and being cool with that, what's been misconceived as cutting corners is actually, you know, we're taking the most efficient route from A to B, and that might be the difference between getting live and beating the competition. The other thing that really irritates me about people describing sound lean architecture as cutting corners is when they also describe it as technical debt. Making a calculated decision to keep things lean is not technical debt. It's the opposite. Look at this. That is technical debt.
Yeah, that's technical debt. So, you know, there is technical debt. We're not disputing that. But what we're saying is that people are in this habit of labeling technical debt as something that must change for me to reach some next step, to reach some new need. If a team has built something based on the needs in front of them at the time, and then a new need comes along and you need to do some rework, that is not technical debt, that's a technical improvement. And you know, technical debt is your security patching, you're fixing your drain that you've obviously not tested properly, but having to pivot the technical stack, it's not, you've not built up a debt, you've got a live system there. You're not compromising quality.
Yeah.
So the third objection was we don't want to duplicate effort and have to rework things in the future.
Yeah, because that's the big misconception, right? That the plan, the design, the blueprints, that all means you'll get it right first time and you'll save time later because you're building for the future. And of course, it'll be reusable for every single scenario or development that we know we need, but actually there's no guarantees about what you'll need.
Unless you can predict the future, like this cat looks like you probably can. But if you can't predict the future, you're going to constrain yourself with a rigid solution that's designed for future requirements that are no more than assumptions and that may never turn up, like in the Queensland Health case.
Yeah. Let's talk about this cost-saving 2-in-1 bread toasting knife then. What do you think of that?
So it looks a bit like a lightsaber, doesn't it? I think I'm guessing that the thought behind it is that if you've got a knife that can toast while it cuts, that you probably don't need to buy another knife and you can and a toaster. So you've saved money on your toaster. But the first thing that comes to my mind is where can I toast my my frozen potato waffles? I'm in a spread.
Or your crumpet.
Or your crumpet. And what if I want to slice something but not toast it? The other thing that we keep seeing is this: is it heating both sides? Because it's probably going to be toasting the edge of your loaf. Do you want that? I think at the end of the day, what's going to happen is you're going to need to buy a toaster anyway, aren't you? So you've not saved yourself any money.
Yeah, totally. And this sort of pursuit of reuse, you see it in software all the time. Now, look this guy up, Doug McIlroy. Okay, he's a really cool dude. Yeah, and great jumper. And he introduced the concept of reuse in software 52 years ago. Yeah, and that's a long time. And there's been a handful of advancements in this area. Some, such as new programming languages with reusable libraries. But since then, the full idea of reuse in systems has never been realized. And that doesn't surprise me because future customer needs are not predictable.
Yeah, so the pursuit of defining architectural solutions where one size will fit all and time is going to be saved at some point in the future seems really compelling, but you'll often end up with a toasting bread knife. And while you're working on developing that, you're actually causing delays and costs are escalating.
Yeah. So here's an example of some iterative architecture that avoids duplication of effort and rework, but is a really good example of improvements over time.
Yeah, so they didn't wait until they had Wikipedia obviously wanted to make a really good encyclopedia, but they didn't wait until they had a massive encyclopedia with a ton of content. They actually went live with a small number of articles, but they had a mechanism for community contributions, and they built a system that can handle change in an unpredictable future. And they've iterated and improved in tech and in areas like the governance where they've had to protect against abuse or bias. They used this open source application, Wikimedia application, which can be reused as a community wiki, which is a nice addition, but they didn't wait and build that out and then go live. That's come along over time. And then for me, like a really good example of like tackling reuse at the right time, they support 285 languages now, but they started with a single English language website. And for me, that's a really good example where you eventually will need that reuse, or you think you need that reuse, but you can pay for that at the point that you're making use of it. You don't need to pay for it before the first thing goes live.
Yeah. So that is a good example. And let's have a look at these guys then. So I'm going to tell you a different story about reuse. And in April 2018, TSB Bank encountered what's been described as an epic meltdown in the pursuit of reuse. So after the banking crisis, TSB was bought by Lloyds, and then it was purchased again by a Spanish group called Banco Sabadell. And they put into motion a plan that they'd successfully executed in the past for several other smaller banks that they'd required. And that was to merge TSB's IT systems with its own banking software. And in doing so, they'd save millions in IT costs. Now, Sabadell were warned in 2015 that this ambitious plan was high risk, but when they were questioned, the reply was that their system had been designed specifically to handle mergers such as this, and so they pressed ahead. Of course, the task proved to be far more complex than they previously encountered. TSB had sprawling legacy that was never fully understood. And once they started to encounter delays, the pressure to deliver and take risks with testing mounted up. But still, despite them knowing that these risks were escalating, they continued. And the planned 18-month project turned into a 30-month project. And it finally went live in 2018. And, they went live. It was a great success. They celebrated. But only 2 hours later, a disaster struck. So 1.9 million customers were locked out of the bank accounts. Mortgage accounts vanished. Small businesses couldn't pay the staff. Debit cards stopped working. Some customers could even see details of other people's accounts. And one user reported seeing a transaction 81 years in the future. If only TSB could have seen the future, eh? And this TSB bank computer crisis of April 2018, as it's called, has been hailed as one of the worst in recent history. And it's a clear case, of how gambling with reuse at any scale can cost you. It's also a valid case of true corner cutting, which happens under pressure when deadlines start to slip. But such slippage is just a classic symptom of dogmatically following a grand plan. So, yeah, it's mental, that story, isn't it, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, why even attempt it at all?
Yeah, common sense is a wonderful thing that tells us that one size does not fit all.
Yeah, I mean, would a startup bank try square pegging existing technologies? They wouldn't, would they? But new digital businesses are always branded as disruptive. Really, they're just iterating along the most efficient paths. It's not disruptors that cause others to fail.
Yeah. So remember, back to the objections where, organizations said that by having a well-defined, collectively approved technical blueprint, a target architecture for the future, that's going to guarantee quality, give confidence in the plan, confidence in timescales, and assurance in the future of our investment.
Yeah, it's utter nonsense.
It's total nonsense. I mean, there's a list of case studies as long as our arms that show otherwise. And these are big companies with intelligent people coming up with feasible plans, incredible feats of architecture, but they still failed.
Which is really obvious because you can't predict the future, can you?
You can't. So here's our 5 ways for a better approach. Number 1, no gold plating. But with product, people have come to really recognize the MVP. Everyone can tell an MVP from a big shebang. But with technology, people find it harder to recognize what is gold plating and what is not. And while architecture has accepted the MVP approach, post-MVP, there can be a tendency to leave that thinking behind, go back to the big bang and really draw out the rest of delivery. So watch out for that, because architectural future-proofing is directly in conflict with MVP.
Yeah, build what you need right now. That way there's more chance that you're going to hit delivery deadlines or even go live at all. And there's more chance that your code is going to be executed, your features are used and tested, and all the bugs are ironed out. There's more chance of assuring that end-to-end quality.
Yeah. Which leads nicely into this. Be clear on what quality is. It's not a matter of taste. Sticking to MVP does not mean taking risks on security or non-functionals. being iterative is about building quality in.
Some of the case study examples we talked about earlier might not have failed if they'd not been attempting to boil the ocean. TSB's case study shows that the consequences of that can be absolutely dire. Focusing on the end-to-end quality of an iteration is going to help you be clear on what you do and do not have to build up front, and it'll help you prioritize the must-haves.
Yeah, and gear up for change. So don't just give the business a platform with requirements. Give them the ability to respond to change. Don't be afraid to pivot, plan for that.
Yeah, that's really key for me. Like, it's like what we said with Wikipedia. Rather than designing an architecture, obviously we do have to do that to meet the immediate needs, but we should be thinking about designing systems of continuous change and helping ourselves continuously improve and iterate upon that. You need to be brave enough really to find out what your solutions are over time and iterate your thinking.
Yeah. I mean, target architecture and the new enterprise architecture is work in progress. I mean, why do you need one big enterprise plan? Do you really know what you need in 10 years' time? If you don't, then don't draw it.
We're not saying don't have a plan, and we're not saying don't think about the future. What we're actually saying is plan more and make decisions to execute parts of that plan at the right time.
Yeah, sometimes the naive solution is the best starting point, and that's how you get to the solution that's right. There's little point agonizing over choosing a technology that's going to be right in 10 years' time, when we all know that today's technologies are tomorrow's legacies. So being adaptive with your target means that you could continuously change your technology easily over the next 10 years and stay ahead of the curve.
Remember that taking the most efficient path from A to B could be the difference between getting live and learning from real feedback, or from missing the boat and falling into the trap of delay upon delay.
Yeah. And you might end up with a completely different tech stack to what you started with. But what's wrong with that? You've not built a legacy that you'll struggle to change. You know, your software is a moving target, evolving and responsive.
It does take quite a bit of confidence and boldness to go with the simple option, and to know when to do that or when to build something a bit bigger.
And the role of the enterprise architect becomes the prolific planner, the energetic reviewer, always looking for the right technologies that enable change and progression, opening the door to options, not spending time thinking about the one and only future state. You know, think about how you can design for multiple future states, and obsess over where the efficient paths are, and be really cautious of falling into the pursuit of reuse trap.
Yeah, a single defined target architecture actually closes options off. It doesn't solve business problems, it's just a document. What we need are insights and options. That's far more valuable to us.
Definitely, you know, understanding the business, obsessing over ever-changing customer needs, and getting closer to the action within teams, taking a journey of solving business problems and becoming an agent for change, being part of figuring all that out, you know, really concentrating on starting with user needs. That will reduce the risk and that will reduce the gamble.
And if you've not seen it, our final recommendation is to watch Kung Fu Panda, because it's brilliant.
Yeah, the end. That's it. Any questions?
Thanks, guys. There's a fascinating tour of iterative architecture there. To the audience, please do put your questions into the chat box. One of our audience says he completely agrees about the Kung Fu Panda. Great film. Please do put your questions into the chat box, and we can address them as we go on. Here's an interesting one for you, Ben and Anna. The idea of grand plan architecture has been around for a long time and doesn't always go wrong. Of course, it leads to monumental firefighting on occasions. But how do you find the balance between iterative improvements and firefighting? Ben.
Iterative improvements and firefighting. So I think that while if you are totally under the cosh of it and you are firefighting constantly, then sometimes it feels like you don't have room to make those improvements. But I think while you're in that mode of firefighting, you're actually probably as close to the iterative approach as you could be, because every step that you take to fix should be a step towards making sure that you don't have to fight that fire again. It's actually, it's obviously high pressure, but it's a really good way of sharpening that approach of, right, well, I can only spend the next, I've got to fix this in the next day. How do I spend that time getting from where we are to a solution that means that next week I'm not firefighting again with the same problem?
I think to a certain extent, though, that you can preempt something like that. So with a more of an iterative approach where you roll out sort of slowly, you tend to gather feedback early, and that usually means that you're gonna uncover some of the stuff that sort of starts you off on that firefighting track, really. If you find that out early, then you can take care of that. But to be honest, running any kind of live system, you are going to encounter some of that, because it's a live service, and the more and more exposure that you have, the more and more that firefighting will escalate. But that is one thing actually that you can predict, that you're going to have to do that. So I think carefully pacing and thinking about rolling out iteratively can mitigate the risk of you sort of arriving at that final destination and having like a lot of fires all in one go. There's a couple of other things that you can do as well, sort of post-release to mitigate against that, and that would be around aligning your teams afterwards. But with regards to sort of architecture itself, we were talking about how sort of the new idea is that that you start thinking about how to respond to that kind of stuff in advance. That is something good to be thinking about early.
One of our audience says, I have been on a firefighting project. To be honest, if you get into that position, then the solution or the testing was wrong. It's a fair point. Another question, how do you enable iterative architecture when our business capabilities are focused on budgets and traditional fixed lifetime projects?
Yeah, well, that goes right back to one of our major objections, wasn't it? That you need to plan it all in now because the budget says so. So to a certain extent, you can. If you have got a pot of money that you need to allocate budget for, then you can. But that doesn't mean to say that you have to fix the target of the future. You can, what you want to be doing is exploring how you have a lot of options for the future. You using your budget that way. So you can have a plan for sure, but your plan might be a bit like the Ohio University, where we think it might be this, but let's leave it a while and see what happens. And that's the sort of the future of planning, is to plan in pivot points, plan in time for feedback, and get budget for that. So your target architecture, you might think on day one, like Facebook started PHP stack, and what they've got today is something completely different. And we're big fans of that, because you're sort of trying to avoid building a legacy then. So think about planning for that, obsess over that.
In the example of the TSB migration, asked one of our attendees, assuming you did have to go ahead with it, how would you tackle this challenge in an iterative way when customers have an existing expectation of features and functionality set out?
Yeah, it's again, it's another really classic major objection that you get, and that is that I think, you know, that's like saying, we know what the customers want. The customers aren't going to like this. They're going to need what they've got today. Well, if you're going to do a carbon copy of what you've got today, then be prepared for the fact that while you're building that, then, you know, that is cost. You know, if you've got that today, why rebuild it? So again, start thinking differently, change the mindset, start obsessing about design, approaching it by starting with user needs, starting from a different angle. Otherwise, if you're going to do a carbon copy, then you will end up with the classic lift and shift. We've recreated it. Well, you've spent 2 years recreating something you already had. Personally, I don't understand why you would do that. So it's about shifting the mindset and thinking about design, thinking architecture design, you know, really enjoying the process of design. What do you think about that one, Ben?
No, I think that's right. I think it always is coming back to user needs. I think when you do that lift and shift replacement, you're setting yourself up for, at the very best, the same as what you've got, most likely the same as what you got, but slightly worse, or a catastrophe like the TSB example. I think it goes right back to, oh, we have to do it. Well, why do you have to do it? The reasons for having to do it are the important point. I think that if you are in that situation where you have to roll it out, it's a bit far down the line, you're a bit screwed. You need to step back one, don't you?
I think if you're going to do a carbon copy, you really, really need to ask yourself the question, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? What are we going to get out of it? You know, we're going to spend millions of pounds in it. In 2 years' time, we're going to end up with what we've got. And hopefully it will go well if you don't cut corners. But you really got to ask yourself the question before you start on something like that. Is this, what are we doing here?
I suppose the other thing with the TSB example is, even in a world where, you know, if you got feature parity, why would you immediately flick a switch to put all your customer base from one system that's proven, and yeah, you're worried that you need to deprecate at some point in the future, to this new system that you've just gone live, and then 2 hours later people are complaining that they can see 81 years into the future?
Here's an interesting one. Somebody who totally agrees with your approach to IT change. Plan for now and be aware that there'll be additional requirements and additional upgrades in the future, and asks, which companies have taken your suggestions and seen the benefits?
Yeah, so we mentioned one, you know, Wikipedia. That's a classic example. It is, unfortunately, you know, there's the cheesy answers all the time, you know, the Facebooks, people like that. There's plenty of them. There's, you know, we could have given many more good examples of this. It does happen. I think it is easier sometimes for new organizations. Like Ben said, they often get labeled as disruptors, but the fact that they're not constrained, they've not got any preconceived ideas, they're really starting from user needs. You have to if you're a startup, or you're going to fail. You've got to be totally focused on your product and what you're going to deliver. And you're usually in this mindset already because you're trying to deliver fast. So they don't have the same constraints as an existing organization. But what, you know, big, you know, sort of more traditional organizations need to do is kind of think, well, what would a startup do? They wouldn't do a lift or shift. But yeah, it is, the newer organizations find it easier because they've got less constraints, but actually after a while they may fall into the trap of some of the things that we've discussed. And it's being mindful of that. But there are lots of organizations that do this well.
Here's a really good one for you. You say engineer for change. Great, but what is that? Ben?
I suppose some of it is, as much as anything, an acceptance that we haven't always got things right. We need to give ourselves a little bit of space to get things wrong. And we can do that by putting tests in and really, like Anna says, obsessing over how do we validate what increments are we doing, and having the I suppose the courage to go back to stakeholders and say, look, this is why we have to take this route. I think a lot of kind of on rails deliveries occur because people, they might in the back of their mind kind of think, oh, like TSB example and like the Queensland example we talked about, people must have seen it coming, but you, as a technical leader, you need to be able to put yourself in a position to say, look, we need to put the brakes on this. And so it's showing that, it's putting those tests in, putting a lot of work into planning what is our iteration going to be, and then also having the, I guess, the courage and boldness to say, actually, do you know what, when we said this before, we didn't, this is the thing we got wrong and we want to change, and going and actually, you know, having the balls to do that.
Yeah, I think making that assumption that you're going to change means that you will then naturally plan for change, you know, build in places where you can you know, assess it. It goes back to a very classic, simple build, measure, learn for me. And whilst that is really, it's become widely accepted within development teams and within product to do that, I think, you know, at a larger scale, enterprise architecture scale, the same can be done.
So here's a question that touches this. What do you do when you realize that things are going wrong? How can you switch over to this lean approach when you're actually in flight?
Yeah, so that is a good question, and it's a similar thing. If you've built in pivot points, then you know you've built in the ability. It's sort of the you've built in the what's the word, like, not the excuse, but you've built in the opportunity to shift. And I think Ben said in the talk, you know, be bold, know when is the right time to keep going, when is the right time to change. And it might feel to the organization that, you know, again, classic objection, we don't want to throw work away. We've started on this path now and we've invested a lot in this, and therefore we will finish it. But we will finish it doesn't have to be we will finish it in the way that we've drawn down here. You know, go back to the drawing board, yeah, and rethink it.
Needs, isn't it?
The money that you've spent has helped you learn what you've found out today. So for me, if anything, it's almost money well spent, because you've learned. It's unfortunate that you've found yourself in this situation, but like we said, if you're planning for change, then you'll have been obsessing about this already. And if you haven't been, well, here's a good excuse to start. So, you know, it's not about rigidly following what's being designed. It's about having, you know, having the imagination to redesign. And that's for me how you would shift. You need to be bold, and you don't want to fall into the trap of, oh God, we have to continue because it's wasted work. Well, no, you've learned something, and actually, let's go back to the drawing board, and we might find that there's a really simple option to get out of this, and get to the solution that we want, the vision that we want, but not necessarily having to stick to what was on paper. What do you think about that one, Ben?
Yeah, I think, again, like I said, going back to user needs. So at any point during a plan, you can go, well, what are we actually trying to achieve? And that can inform whether or not you know, is this plan really still sticking to that? Being kind of pessimistic about it as well. Like, what happens if this plan doesn't succeed? Well, we need to, what we're talking about, de-risking. So the closer you can get to stepping off that plan and saying, right, where are we building in these tests? How close can we get to actually delivering? That's where you should be focusing your efforts, I think.
Yeah.
It's an interesting narrative from one of our attendees. The main thing in the iterative approach is to understand who drives the requirement. Is it technology or the business? I've applied the logic to migrate to new technologies based on business domains while maintaining the integration with legacy. Does that make sense to you, Anna?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. And you know, you do see in a lot of large organisations that there's this typical classic divide between the IT and business. And I think that, you know, it's become accepted now that actually, you know, you need to work together. So I think at one time, the business would chuck requirements over to IT like there was some kind of factory, and that's no good. But then there was also, you know, a moment in time where it was felt that, well, IT is just building what they want, and the business would often spring up a lot of change programs and bring in their own change development teams, almost in protest. We're not getting what we want out of IT, so let's outsource. So let's bring another team in, and this kind of like friction between almost the two sides, you know, it is quite common. And I think what we've seen over time is that the understanding from IT that there are business needs, and the understanding from IT that there's user needs. And when you come together and you start from user needs collectively, jointly, then that's when the magic starts to happen then. And I think that when as IT have recognized that and got closer to the business then start to recognize that actually our business is software. You know, if you think about a digital bank, well, their business is software. Without that software, they're nothing. So there's a sort of realization of this on both sides.
IT supports the business and the business must support IT, says one of our audience.
That's it.
Yeah. And I think that having the fresh mindset of, right, how do we come together to solve the problem? What's the vision? What are we trying to achieve? Starting with user needs, then both sides are starting off on the same foot. They're both ultimately trying to solve the same thing together.
What do you make of this observation? These are not architectural conversations that can be led by engineers. As you've intimated, organizational behavior needs to change first. It's a mindset thing. What is your view of the role of architects in change, particularly in the C-suite of these large organizations?
Yeah, so we touched a bit on this about the new role of architecture, and I think, you know, that really enterprise architecture and the C-suite, you know, understanding the business, being like that is one part of where that role needs to be. But I also think getting closer to the action as well. But, you know, as we've seen, like the BA, the traditional role of the BA is being the documenter. They've become a facilitator, and it's the same with architecture. They're becoming a facilitator for change. So they need to be throughout the business, like the eyes and ears of the organization, really helping the teams, helping drive that understanding and change within the C-suite. And yeah, just like being the eyes and ears of the organization in order to drive change and enable change.
An earlier question touches on this. I think you suggested enterprise architects must engage with the wider business. What guidance do you have for a large federated organization, particularly in relation to pre-budget or approval considerations and steering of requirements or tech? What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, again, this goes back to, if you have got to put forth, you know, traditional business case, ask for budgets, then you still can. Yeah, you still can. You're going to need some money to do something. But what we're saying is that, you know what the outcome is that you want to achieve, but you're not necessarily going to have one set in stone solution that then you hang your hat off for the whole rest of the duration, even when things are going wrong. So it's still, for me, it still works. It still works. We've got a plan, and this is what the plan looks like today. And in our plan, it's got, this is what the plan looks like, you know, if today changes. I think it's still, I've seen it still work. It still work applying. What some organisations will do is that they will really embrace inception periods, discovery phases of work, and that then will help to sort of drive a bit of a culture of experimentation and sort of asking for permission for a period of time to experiment, think things through, and that's quite good for changing the mindset. But you know, and then an MVP, I think that's become more widely accepted. So as part of the budget for the whole thing, we'd like some for this, and we'll roll out an MVP. But the danger is, and we talked about it in the presentation, the danger is that once you've done the MVP, you then go, right, now the rest of it looks like that, get on with it, and you fall back into the old problem. So I actually think it's fine to ask for the money. You want the money, right? But you've got to be mindful of if you do get the opportunity to start iteratively, starting, you know, incrementally, then you don't fall back into the trap once you've done some early delivery, once you've done some early experimentation. For me, the whole thing is an experiment. A living, breathing software is always evolving. What are your thoughts, Ben? Have you got any thoughts on that one?
I mean, I was going to talk a bit about MVP and the amount of work that should go into really teasing out that MVP is really important. And it's all very well kind of having a massive, big MVP, but going back to the value of what is getting live early, what is the valuable thing that you're going for, and making those kind of, I suppose, those gambles much smaller. It's much easier to show your face after, in some people's eyes, wasting a bit of money on a failed MVP that's been very, very cheap and very short, than getting into this delivery mode and then being like, oh, yeah, that's how you end up on those rails, isn't it?
Yeah. So something that's really useful is some organisations will talk about this in terms of bets, and I like that because it is a gamble. We're saying it's a gamble, yeah. So they have a series of bets, and I think that really sort of well illustrates this. But again, if you start off with that mindset of it's a series of bets, you know, but then once you've done a few things, like once you've got your MVP out, if you then forget that, that's where it's kind of a waste of time, really. So it's about like MVP 1. What's MVP 2? Why don't we have 10 MVP? The whole thing is an evolution of MVP. So it's about remembering that thinking, but I think you still can apply for the budget.
We can all have and have had a bit of fun with the car crash stories, TSBs, the classic, I suppose, of the approach you're advocating we move away from. But are there any yet proper, good, fun car crash stories of this approach? Have there been any real drawbacks with it? Ben?
I haven't got any big car crash stories for this approach, but I do think that one thing that might surprise people who are actually going like down this iterative route is it doesn't make the conversations that you have with business or with delivery teams easier. It's still you still have a lot of challenges to overcome, and what we're describing doesn't make everyone's jobs easier. It just de-risks the delivery and makes you less likely to go into this big car crash. And it can be a lot of that. Constant planning is a lot of work. And it requires, you know, there's blockers everywhere because people will automatically, Anna always talks about the big red button, everyone wants to shift back to that old comfortable way of working where you've got a big plan, it feels much more comfortable. So I haven't got any horror stories from this approach, but I do acknowledge that sometimes there's a comfort in that plan, and it's difficult to break out of that.
Anna, you must have a story.
Well, really the same as what we've spoken about, that, you know, you can start off well, and then, you know, what I've often seen is start off really well, really good mindset, but then, like Ben said, I always talk about the big red reset button, and you go back to the traditional way of thinking, and usually it's when a risk comes along or something comes along that's challenging. That could be people challenging you, you know, those common objections that we spoke about. It's difficult when you get those challenges, especially if a lot of it is uncharted territory, which we're saying the future is. And yeah, it's usually that, you know, the challenges come from things like that, and then things can go wrong. You do see startups that have started really well, really promising this kind of approach, then suffering. And it's not what we're proposing, actually, like Ben said, it's not easy. The lean approach is difficult, but for me that's enjoyable. But yeah, it's by no means less effort. It definitely doesn't mean cutting corners, you know, like some people would think. And you do have that battle. And I think sometimes when you start out well, or, you know, perhaps 50% of the organization is really up for it, if you do have a stumbling block, instead of saying, well, we knew there would be some, we knew, you know, this is unpredictable, we knew there would be some stumbling blocks, let's figure it out. The reaction can be big red reset button. This does not work. This approach no longer works. Let's go back to the comfort of that plan. So start with a plan that allows for this. Preempt that. It's dead predictable.
So the iterative architectural car crash is really when you stop doing iterative architecture.
Basically, yeah.
Okay, and a lovely final observation from one of our audience: managing expectations in business change will always be tricky. And I think we've probably got a good quote out of this as well. Brunton, 2020, it's not the disruptors who cause others to fail, they're just iterating along the most efficient path. Very nice. We can all have that on our walls. Thank you, Anna and Ben, for a fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. There's a great deal of material there for us all to take away from this session. We will share the recording with those who've attended and those who wanted to attend but didn't make it, and it'll be available more widely on social media as well. If you think of questions for our speakers, do please email them in, and we'll do our best to address them for you, or at any rate I shall pass them on to Anna and Ben, and I'm sure they will. And in the meantime, do please complete the survey when you close this GoToWebinar session, and give us your thoughts also when a feedback email lands in your inbox in an hour's time. I hope you've enjoyed this session. Thank you for attending. Thank you to Infinity Works for partnering with us on this series of techELITE events. Thank you to Anna Broadhurst and Brent Brunton, and good night.